Alright, so it is my fundamental thesis of this video that the era of the tech bro has essentially come to an end. I'm not saying that there aren't any more tech bros in existence, but that their era has come and gone, effectively. In the mid-2000s to around 2019, probably, we'll say, there was a pretty big boom in tech and just an explosive amount of growth, and a lot of that was due to new frameworks and new technologies being around to be able to build all these apps that we know today, most of which are considered social media apps, but also you've got things from the gig economy like like DoorDash, Uber Eats, and stuff like that. You've also got the, Netflix streaming platforms, etc. But it is my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of other people in tech, that at least on the current Web 2.0 frameworks, paradigms, what can be built essentially has been built. I think people got into their heads this idea that there was infinite growth that could happen and an unlimited amount of new technologies and ideas, and that is true in a sense, but not really in the current state of things, and I'll explain that in a minute. Basically, on the current frameworks and technology, most of the good and capitalistically viable ideas that could be done, for the most part, have been done. There might be a few stragglers that haven't been coded yet or thought of yet, but pretty much, for the most part, what can be done has been done. And when I say capitalistically viable, that's sort of the main thing that is important here, because there's probably a lot of good, creative, interesting app ideas that someone could come up with in their head, but just because it's a good, clever idea doesn't mean that it's going to be capitalistically viable in a way that it could actually make money enough to have a serious business going and make just make a lot of money with it or whatever. And that's what the shortage of those kind of low-hanging fruit, good ideas that could be came up with, like Netflix or whatever. Oh, a streaming platform that anyone can just turn on their TV and it's, they can watch any movie they want, effectively. I don't think it takes a genius to have known in hindsight, oh yeah, that's a good idea that people would pay a bunch of money for, or at least a lot of people would pay a little bit amount of money for it. It didn't really take I know it's easy to say these things in hindsight about social networks and streaming platforms and things that were obviously a good idea, but there was only so many of those low-hanging fruits to begin with, and that's what drew all the tech bros. Back in 2015 and before, we were told by the boomers, the Gen X people, we were told, oh, computers, technology, that's never going away. You better go into tech so you can make a shitload of money. But now it's ridiculously oversaturated and the salaries are basically no good. Before, and so in my opinion, this isn't really that new of a thing, though, because it's really just kind of like this guy Tech Lead has said, and I'll link his video below or something. It's really just turning back to the natural state of things, which is that, nerds don't really make all that much money. Back before, or at least computer nerds, in comparison to the rest of the workforce, because before, in the 80s, before there was a big, profitable, prolific tech boom, people wanted to make money, and they were starting off in the middle class. They wanted to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, pretty much. That was the thing. But then coders which I guess software engineer is a kind of engineer, but not, I mean, it's different than the kind of engineer that you think of when you hear the word engineer. You think of an electrical or a mechanical engineer or aerospace or something like that. Somebody who makes actual things, actual physical things. But for a while, during that early time period, coders in the 80s and 70s, they didn't really make crazy money like that. They didn't get paid better than the whatever the average like white collar guy was making, and maybe even less. They were considered more academics and nerds and stuff, and they weren't making money on the level that draftsmen or architects, engineers, doctors, lawyers, those kinds of more well respected professional careers were making. And now I'm of the opinion that it's kind of going back to that level. It's going back to that natural state. At least until we see the rise of a new paradigm, or the rise of a new set of frameworks and standards that allow for new ideas. And what I mean by that is like a big new technology would have to come out, like usable holograms or VR that's widespread. I know we already have VR, but it's not at the level that it would need to be a widespread technology that everyone wants to use. Also, people are a little bit skeptical of technology right now and being like overly plugged into technology. And rightfully so. I mean, because it can detract from your life pretty horribly. We all know this. But yeah, so basically, that's kind of my idea here, is that the era of the tech bro is over. It's going back to the classic, oh, you want to make a lot of money and you're starting off from a middle class family, you probably should go be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a CPA, accountant. That's like those are stable, realistic paths. Of course, you have to start on those paths pretty early, and you have to have aptitude and intelligence for them. So not everyone can do those, and the schooling is pretty expensive, at least in case of doctors and lawyers. It's pretty expensive. But yeah, and not everybody has the conscientiousness to get to those high up levels. I mean, I know I pretty much don't. That's one thing about me. But yeah, so basically, tech bros are done. You're not gonna unless you unless you go to unless you did really good in high school and you were a super computer genius from the time you were 14 and you got into MIT and you got on with some really good startups, it's just going to be very rare. Whereas in 2015, you could graduate from like a nobody school, just like a low-level state college or something, or even a community college with a degree in information systems or IT or computer science or something. You could graduate relatively low in your class from like not a prestigious program at all, and you could start out making like $70K easily as a computer programmer somewhere, because they were just hiring people off of the streets. It was fucking easy. But we've kind of, I think a lot of us are resentful about the boomers telling us to get into this when it ended up being cooked. They couldn't have predicted that this would happen. I think at the time it seemed like a really safe bet. Like, oh, these computers, they aren't going anywhere. And you're right, they're not going anywhere. But that doesn't mean that they're always going to be like this gold rush. Because I think now everything will hit its plateau eventually, even tech. And I think at least with the current levels of technology and frameworks that we're at, we've pretty much hit that plateau. It's kind of there. There's not really as much social mobility in tech anymore, and yeah, there's just not a whole lot to fight for. But and there's also a lot of argument about whether the United States is really positioned to be competitive in tech. I don't think that the reason why India and other parts of Asia are overtaking us is because their STEM education is so much better. I think that's bullshit billionaire propaganda that they want you to think. I think that's fully cap. I think that's a lie. I think the reason is because, well, simply because they're cheaper. And so, like, if they overtake us in tech workers, it'll be because they can flood the market with cheap labor. And so that'll only drive down the prices. But one of the areas that we as the West kind of excels at is media and communication and personalities and entertainment and stuff like that. We kind of have the stranglehold on that. Nobody, the rest of the world, it's probably because we speak English, if I'm being realistic, but the rest of the world um, doesn't have much of a hold on that little world, because most people speak English, but not everybody speaks like Chinese or French, and so been able to they haven't been able to be as like creative and unique as us because of a number of like cultural factors. We're also just like a very individualistic society. But yeah, that's like a whole nother conversation. But yeah, so I'm calling it, as of today, the era of the tech bro is over, and if you want to be a millionaire, I don't know, you're better off figuring out something else, in my opinion.